September 1st, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. In the muggy operations tent, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai hovered his hand over an intelligence sheet, his single working eye, its partner taken by American gunfire the year before, moving across the lines until a loud laugh escaped him. The Americans, the report claimed, had built a new fighter, as heavy as a bomber, as broad as a transport. They called it the Hellcat. Intelligence estimated it weighed twice as much as the Zero, just one more American design blunder. Beyond the tent flaps, his A6M Zero sat on pierced steel planking, sleek, agile, lethal. For 2 years they had ruled the Pacific sky, cutting down British Hurricanes, American P-40s, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes, everyone who came up against Zero guns. This swollen Hellcat, Sakai assumed, would join the list. What he didn't know, what none of the Japanese naval aviators filing into the morning briefing knew, was that in precisely 30 days, this failure would begin the methodical destruction of Japanese naval aviation. The F6F Hellcat would rack up a kill ratio of 19-1, claiming 5,223 enemy aircraft, while losing only 270 in aerial combat. It would reshape carrier warfare, snap Japanese air power in half, and expose that the Zero's terror had rested on fatal assumptions. The arithmetic of air superiority was about to be rewritten by a machine that looked wrong, flew heavy, and seemed to defy every principle Japan believed it had mastered. And within 6 months, the pilots, laughing at these reports, would be writing final letters home, understanding that meeting Hellcats meant a statistical certainty of death. The rising sun at its peak. In September 1943, the Japanese Navy's certainty wasn't simply bravado, it was numbers. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had produced victory ratios that sounded unreal. At Pearl Harbor, 29 aircraft lost, 347 destroyed. In the Philippines, 7 losses for 103 kills. Over Darwin, 2 losses against 30. The British Far East Fleet's air arm wiped out. The Dutch East Indies Air Force erased in days. At the heart of that dominance was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, a fighter that had overturned the accepted rules of design. When American engineers tested captured examples in 1942, the figures seemed too extreme to accept. Bomber-like range, biplane-like maneuverability, and enough firepower to destroy anything it trapped. It felt impossible. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishiwa, who would become Japan's ace of aces with 87 confirmed kills, captured the sensation in his recovered diary. Flying the Zero felt like wearing wings. The machine answered intention, not just control pressure. American aircraft, he wrote, drove like trucks, strong but awkward. They built fighters the way they built cars, heavy, overbuilt, wasteful. The Zero achieved its astonishing performance through a radical philosophy of sacrifice. Extra super duralumin, a secret aluminum alloy, produced a structure 30% lighter than comparable American airframes. There was no armor plate for the pilot, no self-sealing tanks to add weight. Often, even the radio was removed to save 30. Every ounce offered up to performance. The intelligence dismissal. Early in 1943, the first details about the F6F Hellcat filtered into Japanese intelligence via neutral Swedish channels. The listed specifications read like propaganda, or perhaps intentional deception. Loaded weight, 12,186 pounds. A Zero, 5,800.
Wing area – 334 квадратних фута.
A big radial engine dragging through the air. Ammunition, 2400 rounds. Armor plate throughout. Bulletproof glass. Self-sealing tanks holding 250 grams of fuel. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, Captain Minoru Genda, the tactician credited with planning Pearl Harbor, studied the figures. His judgment, preserved in the Japanese defense archives, was coldly contemptuous. The Americans had learned nothing. The Hellcat, he argued, was simply their old, failed mindset continued, trying to replace pilot skill with brute machinery. A Zero would spin circles around it. And the math seemed to agree. The Zero's wing loading, 22 pounds per square foot, produced a turning radius of 612 feet. The Hellcat's, 36.5 pounds per square foot, implied a radius beyond 900 feet. In a turning battle, the foundation of Japanese fighter doctrine, the Hellcat should be powerless. The first glimpse, September 30th, 1943. Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was escorting a reconnaissance flight when he saw them. 6 dark blue aircraft climbing from the southeast. His first reaction, written later in his after-action report, was simple. B-25 bombers on an odd course. Then they banked, and the shape snapped into focus. One engine, a thick fuselage, wings that looked too short for the body, a silhouette unlike anything he expected. First encounter with F6F pipe fighter, he would note, adding his immediate conclusion. The Americans had bolted fighter guns onto something the size of a torpedo bomber. Yet he engaged using standard tactics. Standard tactics meant exploiting the Zero's tighter turning circle to slip onto an opponent's tail. Fukui rolled into a diving turn, confident the heavy American fighter would hold its line, letting him arc neatly onto its 6 o'clock. But then something happened that he had no framework for. The Hellcat didn't run. It didn't try to outturn him. It went straight up. Driven by the Pratt & Whitney R28000 double Wasp, 2,000 horsepower, 700 more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai at 1,130, the American aircraft climbed at 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui tried to follow and felt the trap close immediately. Airspeed bled away as the Zero fought gravity. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat executed a maneuver that seemed impossible for something so large. A hammerhead that pivoted it cleanly onto Fukui's tail. The American opened fire at 400 meters, Fukui wrote later. 6 machine guns, not the 4 we expected. The volume of fire was unprecedented. My aircraft took 17 hits in 3 seconds. Only by dropping into a spin did I escape. Fukui lived, just, limping back to Marcus Island with his Zero riddled with holes. His wingman, Petty Officer Secondus Masao, did not return. Neither did the reconnaissance aircraft they were escorting. The Hellcat had drawn first blood, and the paradox of weight had begun to reveal itself. October 5th, 1943. Task Force 14 struck Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept what looked like another nuisance raid. For months, American carriers had been launching quick hit-and-run attacks, usually pulling away before Japanese fighters could bring the fight to them. This time, the Japanese believed, would not follow the pattern. We climbed to 20,000 feet, Shiga noted in his diary. Below us, 12 F6F fighters in 3 divisions. We held every advantage: altitude, position, surprise. Victory was certain. What followed broke Japanese tactical logic at its foundation. As the Zeros dived onto the Hellcats, the Americans didn't scatter, and they didn't try to turn inside the attack. They held formation and eased into a controlled dive, keeping their energy high and their options open. When the Zeros opened fire from maximum range, hoping for lucky damage, the Hellcats simply endured it. The F6F carried protection the Japanese could scarcely imagine. 212 pounds of armor plate for the pilot, 110 pounds around the oil system, and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb repeated hits. And when the Zeros had burned through ammunition in diving passes, the counterstroke came. The Hellcats did not dogfight. They weaponized mass. Climbing at full power, they reached heights where the Zero's engine began to starve. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat still produced 1,650 horsepower. The Zero had dropped to 900. They came down on us like hawks on sparrows, Shiga wrote. Their weight gave them speed we couldn't match. They would dive, fire those 6 terrible guns, then climb away before we could react. 8 Zeros fell. No Hellcats were lost. The Marianas turkey shoot as prophecy. November 11th, 1943. Rabaul. Pilots of the 204th Air Group sat listening as Lieutenant Commander Tao Tanimizu laid out what he had learned the hard way. With 32 victories, Tanimizu was among the rare few who had survived repeated encounters with Hellcats. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told them. "The Americans have changed the rules. They no longer fight our fight. They fight like executioners, not warriors." He explained what Japanese pilots were discovering too late. The Hellcat was not built to outturn the Zero, because it didn't have to. Its advantage was doctrine. Using what the Americans called energy fighting, Hellcat pilots preserved speed and altitude, converting height into violent, slashing attacks that left Zero pilots no time to exploit maneuverability. "They work in pairs," Tanimizu continued. "One high, one low. While you engage one, the other is already diving on you." Even the radios, once marked as unnecessary weight, became a weapon, allowing tight coordination in the air. "We fly as individual samurai," he said. "They fight as a machine." December 1943. Tia Lagoon. Commander Mitsuo Fuida, the man who had led the strike on Pearl Harbor, now served as Air Operations Officer for the combined fleet. Inspecting damaged Zeros returning from Hellcat encounters, he saw the widening gap not as opinion, but as arithmetic. The difference in firepower could be counted. The Hellcat's 6 Browning M2 guns fired 750 rounds per minute each, 4,500 rounds per minute in total. Each 50 caliber bullet weighed 46 grams and left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, carrying 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. The Zero's 27.7mm machine guns fired lighter projectiles, 11 grams, at 2,300 feet per second, about 750 foot-pounds of energy. But more alarming than guns were the reports of radar-guided fighter direction. Japanese pilots still hunted with their eyes. Hellcat pilots were being guided by shipboard radar controllers who could see Japanese aircraft from 50 miles away. Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi described his first radar-directed interception. "We were climbing through clouds when they hit us. No warning, no visual contact. Hellcats diving from above, exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned. They knew our position, our altitude, our track, our approach. We were fighting like blind men against an enemy who could see through darkness." The Pilot Equation, January 1944. Japan's pilot crisis was sliding into catastrophe. Before the war, the Imperial Navy's training pipeline had been the most punishing on Earth. 3 years, and a new naval aviator typically arrived at the front with around 700 flight hours. Army pilots were expected to have at least 500. They were not simply taught to fly. They were shaped into specialists in aerobatics, gunnery, and the spiritual discipline of air combat. But by early 1944, naval pilots were being thrown into battle with roughly 300 hours, and Army pilots with 200. Fuel scarcity hollowed out the program. Much of training shifted to gliders. Live fire practice shrank to about 50 rounds per pilot. Formation work, instrument flying, radio procedure cut away to push bodies to the front. Meanwhile, American aviators were arriving with a minimum of 300 hours, including about 50 hours in the specific aircraft type. They had fired thousands of practice rounds, repeated carrier landings until muscle memory took over, and learned energy tactics safely over Texas training fields. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, a training officer at Kasumigara Naval Air Station, summed it up in his final report. "We are sending children to fight professionals." He noted one case from the previous day. Ensign Yamamoto reached the front having never fired his guns in flight. There was no ammunition for practice. Never flown at night, there was no fuel for it. And he survived 7 minutes in his first combat. The Formosa Revelation. October 12th to 16th, 1944. The Battle of Formosa. Vice Admiral Shagaru Fukuome, commanding the 2nd Air Fleet, threw everything he had at the American carrier raids. Over 700 aircraft, including the last trained pilots pulled from homeland training units. Japanese claims were triumphant. 26 carriers and battleships sunk. 300 enemy aircraft destroyed. The truth, visible only after pilots returned and gun camera film was processed, was devastating. Actual American losses were 89 aircraft. Japanese losses were 329. Along with almost every experienced pilot still left. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few veterans who survived, described it in his memoirs. Hellcats were positioned at every altitude. When they climbed, Hellcats were above. When they dived, Hellcats were below. The sky had been divided into grids, each sector covered by a division. It wasn't combat, he said. It was organized extermination. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. June 19th, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Japan committed its rebuilt carrier force to Operation Argo, the decisive battle meant to shatter American carrier strength in the Pacific. 9 carriers, 450 aircraft, and what they believed were their best remaining pilots. Opposing them was Task Force 58, 15 carriers and 956 aircraft, including 450 F6F Hellcats. Admiral Jabaro Ozawa launched strikes in 4 waves, convinced Japanese skill and the Zero's range would carry the day. The first wave, 69 aircraft, lifted off at 0830. American radar saw it at Stowe-Pitisat miles. Hellcats were vectored into interception with near-perfect geometry. Altitude advantage, the sun behind them. Approaches from Japanese blind sectors. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the escort, spotted the Hellcats only minutes before contact, stacked between 20,000 and 30,000 feet, at least 60 aircraft, hanging like a steel curtain. His formation sat at 18,000. Every advantage belonged to the Americans. The fight lasted 12 minutes. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft, 42 were shot down. Commander David McSell, CAG of Air Group Petnats, claimed 7 that day. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, claimed 6. The Zeros tried to turn with us, McSell reported. We simply refused. We'd make a high side pass, shoot one down, then zoom back to altitude. They'd try to follow, stall out, and another Hellcat would take them. By day's end, Japan had lost 346 carrier aircraft, plus 50 land-based aircraft. American losses: 30 aircraft from all causes. That evening, in ready rooms across the fleet, American pilots gave the battle its name, Turkey Shoot, because the enemy aircraft had seemed as helpless as game birds. The Lee Gulf Record. October 24, 1944. The Battle of Lady Gulf. Commander David McCampbell set a single mission record during the fighting. Leading 7 Hellcats from Essex, he intercepted roughly 60 Japanese aircraft headed toward the American fleet. Over the next 90 minutes, McKell shot down 9, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers, while his wingman, Roy Rushing, destroyed 6 more. I ran out of ammunition after the 9th kill, McKell recorded. The Hellcat, he noted, never faltered. Despite being outnumbered 8-1, his aircraft returned without a single hit. The engagement captured the full reversal of air superiority. 7 Hellcats scattering 60 Japanese aircraft, destroying 15 without loss. McCampbell's Ace in a Day performances, 7 kills on June 19th and 9 on October 24th, earned him the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. The psychological collapse. The aftermath of the Philippine Sea and Lady Gulf left behind a psychological wreckage that Japanese military psychologists would later describe as Hellcat psychosis among the pilots who survived. In his after-action report, Admiral Ozawa wrote that the enemy's radar-directed fighter control had achieved what Japan had assumed could not be done: the industrialization of air combat. A Hellcat, he argued, was no longer an individual duelist in the sky. It was one moving part inside a vast, coordinated machine. However skilled a Japanese aviator might be, he was not fighting a plane. He was fighting a system. The shortage of trained airmen spiraled so fast that by early 1945, the training pipeline collapsed into emergency measures. Roughly 40 to 50 hours for Navy pilots, 60 to 70 for Army pilots. Kamikaze candidates received only 40 to 50 hours in total, about 7 days, before being sent to die. The Okinawa apocalypse followed from April through June 1945 under Operation Iceberg, with Japan launching 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the American fleet off Okinawa. Here, the Hellcat became more than a fighter. It became the shield against desperation itself. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, commanding his Flying Circus Division, downed 23 Japanese aircraft during the campaign. And his tactical refinements, coordinated 4-plane divisions striking as one, turned many traditional Japanese responses into suicide.
We developed what we called the mowing machine, Valencia explained.
4 Hellcats abreast, about 100 yards apart, slicing through formations at high speed, each pilot responsible for his sector. 1 pass, then a climb back to altitude, then another pass, again and again. The numbers at Okinawa were brutal and clear. Hellcats flew 38,038 combat sorties, claimed 2,351 victories for 249 losses, a 9.5 to 1 ratio, and, more importantly, stopped roughly 80% of kamikaze aircraft from reaching their targets.
By 1945, the technology gap had widened into something Japan could not cross.
The F6F Hellcat carried refinements that made it deadlier still. Water injection, raising power to 2,200 horsepower. Zero-length rocket launchers, improved protection. And the K-14 computing gun sight that automatically calculated deflection. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's famed ace, credited officially with 28 victories, though many modern historians suggest closer to 15, met Hellcats for the first time in June 1944. And even he nearly died in that first encounter.
In his autobiography, he wrote that he threw everything he had into the fight. Loops, rolls, splits, every maneuver polished across 200 combats. Yet the Hellcat stayed with him easily, almost casually. He survived only because, as he put it, the American pilot made a mistake. He failed to jettison his drop tank before engaging. By war's end, the human cost could be tallied like an account sheet. The F6F Hellcat had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, lost 270 to enemy fighters, achieved a 19.3 to 1 kill ratio, produced 305 U.S. Navy aces, and accounted for 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories. For Japan, the result was annihilation. Of the 18,000 naval aviators who began the war, fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots remained by August 1945. The turn to kamikaze operations was, in effect, the final admission of Hellcat supremacy. When conventional victory became impossible, Japan converted pilots into guided missiles. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze program, justified it with cold arithmetic. A Zero attacking a carrier conventionally had almost no chance. Hellcats would destroy it. A Zero turned into a bomb raised the probability of a hit to 30%. The pilot died either way. At least, as a kamikaze, his death could be claimed as meaningful. On October 25, 1944, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa escorted the first official kamikaze mission led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, scoring his 86th and 87th victories, 2 F6F Hellcats along the way. The next day, October 26, 1944, Nishizawa died as a passenger in a transport aircraft shot down by Hellcats from VF-14. Japan's greatest ace, without a fighter of his own, fell helplessly to the very aircraft he had briefly beaten. Then came the final testimony. August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast. At Atsugi Airfield, Captain Minoru Genda, who had once dismissed the Hellcat as mere weight without finesse, listened to the Emperor's voice with what remained of Japanese naval aviation around him. Teenage pilots with 40 hours of flight time, aircraft patched from spare parts, fuel tanks running dry. That same day, Ensign Clarence Moore of VF-31, flying from USS Belleau Wood, shot down a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber just after 2 p.m., the last aerial victory of World War II. The Japanese pilot, apparently unaware of the surrender, was still closing on the American fleet when Moore intercepted him. 2 short bursts from the Hellcat's 6 guns ended the Pacific Air War. A month later came the occupation revelation. In September 1945, at Atsugi, the first American aircraft to land after the surrender were 12 F6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crew lined the runway to see their tormentor at close range. One of the American flyers, Lieutenant Robert Vasu, an ace credited with 19 victories, demonstrated the Hellcat's capabilities for the Japanese pilots, who had spent the final years of the war learning, too late, what it meant to fight an airplane that was never meant to fight alone. His relaxed aerobatics, loops, rolls, and climbing turns that would have shaken a Zero apart, left the Japanese on the runway staring in silence. "You have to understand," Vatu told them through an interpreter. "This isn't even pushing it. In combat, with water injection, it's 20% more powerful. The airframe is stressed for 13 Gs. I've never managed to break one." The engineering post-mortem. When Japanese engineers examined captured Hellcats after the war, they discovered what air combat had been hinting at all along: the true scale of American industrial superiority. The Pratt & Whitney R28000 engine was built from 2,840 precision-machined parts, each one standardized, each interchangeable with any other R28000. The Nakajima Sakai, by contrast, depended on hand fitting. Components were matched and adjusted by touch. No 2 engines were truly identical. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, the designer of the Zero, studied the Hellcat in detail after the surrender, and his conclusion landed like a verdict. "We designed an aircraft for 1941, he said. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we were perfecting the sword, they were building the industrial age, the production miracle. Grumman's manufacture of the Hellcat became a weapon in its own right. At Bethpage, New York, the factory ran without pause, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At peak tempo, a new Hellcat emerged from the line every 60 minutes. In 30 months, the company produced 12,275 aircraft, numbers Japan could barely comprehend. In 1944, Japan built 5,100 fighters of all types. America built 35,000 fighters in that year alone. And the system behind those numbers was as alien as the airplanes themselves. Color-coded instructions guiding workers through complex assemblies, shifts rotating around the clock, quality holding steady even as speed increased. Japan could build brilliant machines. America could build a machine that built machines, endlessly, reliably, at scale. The strategic revolution. The Hellcat did not merely win engagements, it rewired naval warfare. Before the war, doctrine assumed carriers were fragile platforms, forced to strike first or die. The Hellcat flipped the equation. Carriers became fortresses, able to take an incoming blow, absorb it, and destroy the attacker in the process. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, understood what that meant.
With the Hellcat, he said, we don't need to find them first.
Let them come. The F6F will destroy them at our convenience. That confidence unlocked a new kind of offensive. American carriers could sit off hostile coastlines for weeks, their Hellcat umbrella turning them into air-defended bases at sea, effectively immune to air attack. The cultural collision. Beyond metal and horsepower, the Hellcat carried a philosophy that invalidated Japanese doctrine at its roots. Samurai tradition prized individual excellence, spiritual endurance, and the acceptance of death. The Hellcat embodied the opposite: systematic efficiency, material advantage, and the deliberate preservation of life. That gap in worldview mattered. Even when Japanese pilots began to understand Hellcat tactics, adapting to them required habits that felt dishonorable, even impossible. Refusing combat when disadvantaged, central to Hellcat doctrine, was unthinkable to men trained in Bushido. In the air, this wasn't only a contest of planes. It was a collision of cultures, and one culture was optimized for a different century. The judgment of history. In 1962, the United States Navy convened a symposium on Pacific War aviation. American and Japanese veterans met again, now with the distance of years and the clarity of hindsight. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces with 34 victories, put it bluntly: the Hellcat won the Pacific Air War. Period. It destroyed Japanese aviation and made our victory inevitable. Commander Saburo Sakai answered with a sentence that captured the lesson Japan had learned too late. The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We never understood the difference until it was too late. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost. The ultimate reckoning. The Hellcat's dominance can be expressed as simple mathematics, and the numbers tell a story larger than any single battle. A kill ratio of 19-1 overall, 13-1 specifically against Zeros. 12,275 Hellcats produced in 30 months. Zeros built between 1943 and 1945, about 6,000. American pilots trained on Hellcats, over 5,000. Japanese combat-capable pilots remaining by August 1945, fewer than 100. Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, who had commanded at the Philippine Sea, offered perhaps the most honest assessment of all. We laughed at the Hellcat because we did not understand it represented not just an aircraft, but an entire civilization's approach to war. By the time we stopped laughing, our air forces had ceased to exist. The last word. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai lived until 2000. In his final interview, he was asked what the Hellcat truly meant. His answer carried the weight of an era. The Zero made Japan a great naval power. The Hellcat made Japan realize it was never as great as it believed. We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were just men with outdated weapons facing the future. He ended with the bitterest conclusion of all. Every Japanese pilot who survived did so because a Hellcat pilot chose to let him live. The ultimate defeat was not being beaten. It was existing at your enemy's discretion. The F6F Hellcat entered service weighing twice what the Zero weighed, carrying armor the Zero did not, powered by an engine Japan could not build, armed with weapons it could not match, guided by radars it could not see, flown by pilots it could not replace, and produced in numbers it could not imagine. Japanese aviators had mocked it,
because they mistook every extra pound for weakness, never realizing each pound represented the strength of an industrial democracy that could afford to protect its airmen. By the time they understood, laughter had turned into last letters home, mockery into kamikaze missions, confidence into collapse.
The Hellcat did not simply defeat the Zero. It crushed an entire philosophy of war, proving that in modern combat, the nation that builds the better system will destroy the nation that builds only better warriors. The Japanese pilots laughed at the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat had the last laugh.
It always did.